The story of Atlantis has gripped the public's mind for centuries. Atlantis is everywhere now. Films, books, conspiracy theories, on reality TV, and basically every entertainment medium that exists. The tale of Atlantis is extremely compelling. The idea that a civilization once exists beneath the waves is the perfect stuff for popularization and extrapolation. However many conspiracy theories may wish you to believe it, the idea that there was a continent in the North Atlantic 10,000 years ago that developed an advanced civilization is basically disproven. A multitude of theories exist to explain it, however, ranging from Plato made it up to have a civilization to betray the morals he held dear, to it being aliens or whatever crap conspiracy folks believe now, with my favorite being that it was a mistranslation for another city that was destroyed in a flood in Turkey. However, since this channel is based on what could have happened instead of what happened, it begs the question, what if Atlantis existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. Before I start this alternate history, I'd just like to say I'm only using Plato canon here. No later editions, no advanced technology, no aliens, no conquest of half the planet. Also, this is not strictly going to follow the Plato canon either. The issue is what Plato wrote as mythology. It comes from a very different plane of existence from history, where numbers mean less and everything is way more epic. The issue is that if you plop a mythological thing against a real thing, the mythological thing would dominate and it wouldn't be very interesting. Also, we find that mythologized accounts based off real accounts are often grossly exaggerated. For example, in the mythological account, King Arthur conquered all of Britain, Scandinavia, Germany, and France, while the real historical Arthur, if he existed, was probably just a successful war chief who united parts of Western England. Or, the Troy of reality was nowhere near as magnificent as the Troy of mythology. So if we want to create an accurate Atlantis, we need to cut back on Plato's details. Also, Plato is very thin with details. I read the Critias and the Timaeus to make this alternate history, and Plato is very sparing. Altogether, he's only written a few pages on Atlantis total. This means to make an accurate picture, I'm going to have to compare Atlantis to similar historical civilizations at that same time period. The big question would be, how big would Atlantis be? Plato says it was the size of Libya and Asia Minor combined. In those days, Libya meant all of North Africa west of Egypt, and for those of you who don't know, Asia Minor roughly corresponds to modern-day Turkey. I added this territory up, and it would be roughly two-thirds the size of Australia, roughly as big as projected on the map that I'm currently showing you. We have no clue what shape Atlantis would be, so let's just keep Australia and the North Atlantic for the memes that will inevitably spring from this. Plato says that Atlantis was directly west of the Straits of Gibraltar. If this is the latitudinal center of Atlantis, and if we use the two-thirds of Australia model, Atlantis would roughly correspond to the same latitudes as the US and China, with the top of Atlantis being at the same latitude as Manchuria, France, and Maine, and with the bottom of Atlantis roughly corresponding to Florida, Fujian province, and the Moroccan territory of Western Sahara. Plato mentions elephants in Atlantis, which means it must have had some sort of connection with a neighboring continent within the last 25 million years. As long ago as this sounds to most people, in geological time, this is actually pretty recent, meaning Atlantis would not have had the weird island wildlife Australia has or South America had a few million years ago, and thus would mean that it's possible that a land bridge would have existed during the last ice age when sea levels were lower, thus meaning that early humans could have walked to Atlantis. If the land bridge is earlier, like let's say 2 million years ago, humans would have sailed to Atlantis during the last ice age. This is not as unlikely as it sounds. Deep-sea fishing did happen in Ice Age Europe, and the lower sea levels would have made the voyage easier. There's even genetic and archaeological evidence that Ice Age Europeans sailed to America 20,000 years ago. I'm not going to have Atlantean civilization being founded in 12,000 BC in time for it to be an ancient society when it would collapse in 10,000 BC, or whenever Plato meant for it to exist. Reason A, I'm taking the stance this is clearly mythologized and hyperbole, and B, there's a reason farming did not develop before the end of the last ice age. The first farming in the Middle East was triggered by the apocalyptic hellscape that was the Younger Dryas, which is a totally awesome event, which you should look up because I don't have time to describe it here. The link to its Wikipedia entry is in the description. Also, it took thousands of years of Neolithic farming to develop civilization in almost everywhere where civilization developed independently, and this would be true with Atlantean civilization as well, which would mean that if we want Atlantean civilization to be founded in 12,000 BC, farming in Atlantis would have to be founded in 16,000 BC, which I simply don't find plausible, since Atlantis would probably be barely settled by humans, if at all, by that point. So instead, I'm going to have the Atlanteans exist in the same technological tract as the Sumerians, who are already thought to be unbelievably old by the Greeks. Also, Plato never actually mentions the Atlanteans as being really technologically advanced, so I'm not fully deviating from the story by doing this. Also, Plato mentioned the Atlanteans as contemporaries to the ancestors of the Greeks and to the ancient Egyptians, and having the Atlanteans exist in 10,000 BC would make this impossible. If we assume the Atlanteans developed agriculture independently from the Middle East around 10,000 BC, we also have to assume they have their own native substitute for wheat, which had not left the Middle East by this point. Plato talks about Atlantis being an expansionist power, conquering North Africa, Iberia, Italy, and invading Greece, but from what I can glean about Atlantis' geography, this is probably a fluke. Atlantis would probably be one of the most isolated large continents on the planet. It's an island, a big island, but still an island, hundreds of miles separated from any major continent. I found that civilizations that developed in isolated areas are almost always isolationists for much of the ancient era. Civilization probably developed independently in China, the Indus Valley, the Fertile Crescent, and Egypt in the Old World. All of these regions, except the Fertile Crescent, were highly isolationist for most of their ancient history. This is not a coincidence. The Fertile Crescent is the opposite of isolated. It was surrounded by mountains and deserts filled with aggressive tribes, and could and was constantly attacked from all sides. Egypt, China, and the Indus Valley are all effectively cut off on all sides, except one or two. Thus, Atlantis would likely be isolationist for the first few thousand years of its existence. What happened to Egypt and China that led them to becoming expansionist world powers is that they were both invaded or conquered by outsiders, and this woke them up to the outside world. For Egypt, this was around 2000 BC, when the Near Eastern Hyksos tribe conquered Egypt, and for the Chinese, this was around 100 BC, when the Chinese had to fight a series of lengthy wars against the nomadic Mongolian Xiongnu tribes. A similar process would likely happen to trigger Atlantis into becoming a major power. Such an attack would likely happen much earlier than we would like to think. Since there wasn't any literacy, Neolithic or Bronze Age Europe was probably more advanced than we expect, and it feels like every few years a discovery is made blowing us away about the advancement of Neolithic/early Bronze Age Europe. Long-distance trade was far more common than you would expect, with all of Neolithic Western Europe being connected by sea trade. It's not impossible to think that raiding by European pirates could have caused an Atlantic reaction that could have resulted in an empire between 2000 and 1500 BC. People like to overhype the Atlantean Empire, saying it would be huge and they draw ridiculous maps like this, but the size of the Atlantean Empire, as portrayed by Plato, is actually a fairly realistic size for a Bronze Age empire. It would probably not even crack the 20 largest empires in history in our timeline. For a large nation like Atlantis, conquering the lightly settled Spain, Italy, and the Maghreb is not ridiculous. Also, Plato said that Atlantis was able to form an alliance of all the Atlantic bordering nations, and in our timeline this would include the Celts, pre-Indo-European peoples of Europe, and the Berbers. And Plato also says that the Atlanteans conquered Egypt during what would be the expansionist and powerful New Kingdom according to our timescale. This is less likely, but with the right generals and tactics could have been done. Also, the Atlanteans in just sheer size and in sheer numbers of men and in military strength would by far be the most powerful nation on Earth. An expansionist Atlantean kingdom would have probably expanded west into the New World, probably conquering and settling on the east coast of North America and the Caribbean. These regions only barely had agriculture at this point, if at all, and so would not have offered much trouble. They would likely defeat the Proto-Maya and Olmec peoples due to technological advantage. In our timeline, Mexican tribes used the quote-unquote advanced technology of the atlatl spear thrower to conquer much of the Maya kingdoms in the 8th century. Imagine how it would have turned out in the 12th century BC against Atlanteans armed with chariots and Bronze Age swords. For those of you that don't know, the late Bronze Age in the Middle East was very much like early modern Europe, a time of balance of power politics in which the different powers were fairly stable and competed to maintain the balance of power and press themselves forward in it. And removing Egypt from this balance of power situation is sort of like removing Britain from early modern European politics. It would completely change things, and the result of this would probably be that the Hittites would conquer much of the Middle East. For those of you who don't know, the Hittites were an Indo-European people who lived in modern-day Turkey and were a major Middle Eastern power. They basically fought the Egyptians to a standstill in Syria, and having Egypt be conquered by the Atlanteans, who would have already been overstretched, would free up the Hittites who would be able to conquer the Levant and then conquer Mesopotamia. Plato also mentions a Greek coalition being formed against the Athenians. I have no problem with this, and I find it highly realistic. He also says when the Atlanteans would invade Greece, the coalition would defeat them. Again, the Persians showed this to be possible, and I have no problem with this. The Atlanteans would be prevented from conquering the Middle East, because the size of the Hittite Empire would definitely be able to stop them, and the Atlanteans would be very far from home, with their reinforcement and command lines probably being dragged to the limit. Having an entire continent the size of Australia simply sink into the ocean is simply impossible unless something drastic would happen. But I still can't have Atlantean civilization collapse or decline very quickly. This is the Bronze Age collapse, when every nation in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East collapsed or went into serious decline within a few decades. This was caused by many different variables: the rise of iron, invasions of the Sea Peoples, climate change, drought, etc. We don't know how it would have affected the Atlantic and Western Europe, but climate change and the rise of iron disrupting political balance would have affected the Atlanteans just as much as the Near East. Even if the Atlantean Empire survived the Bronze Age collapse, they would have three perils awaiting them, the first being the Indo-European invasions. This was when nomadic peoples from the Caucasus conquered a huge swath of Eurasia, from Britain to India. They basically defeated anyone who got in their way, so no offense Atlantis, but your colonies in Italy and southern France are screwed. The second is their decentralized form of government. Plato says the Atlantis had a system where multiple kings ruled the vast land, working together for the good of the empire. As good as it sounds, in the ancient world, this was almost always asking for disunity, with civil war between the different kings happening very often, or the kings just seceding from one another as Atlantis would disunite. The third being that they would suffer the isolated ancient empire syndrome. Neither Egypt nor China were able to become full world powers because their isolated geographic position and isolationist viewpoints makes it hard to maintain a colonial empire for a long time. I've noticed that Chinese empires always make it to a line in Central Asia, but never make it any further, and Egypt only really had one major fling at being an empire. This is mainly for geographic and cultural reasons. Either way, the Atlantean Empire would not make it long past 1200 BC. Certain regions would simply revert back to their original regimes after the collapse of the Atlantean Empire. The Egyptians in Almak, for example, would probably flip back to their previous regimes like nothing happened. The decline of the Atlantean Empire would create a very different world for the present. Firstly, the Americas would be just as advanced as the Old World. The Atlanteans would have brought Old World animals to the New World thousands of years earlier. This would improve connections and trade between the Native American societies, thus improving technology. I've already made a timeline about this, the link to which is in the description. It's called What If the Native Americans Had Horses? Also, the connections would make the Native Americans immune to European diseases, and this would also apply to technology, and the Native Americans would be able to adopt old world technologies and adapt. Also, leftover Atlantean kingdoms and wannabe Atlantean kingdoms would develop on both sides of the Atlantic. In the Old World, these would be concentrated in Spain and North Africa, who would be far enough away to not be devastated by the Indo-Europeans. This is similar to how nations like Korea, Vietnam, and Japan developed their own cultures with a great amount of cultural influence from China, even though actual Chinese control of these regions has been sparing to none. Another example of how the European kingdoms of the Middle Ages and modern period looked up to the Roman Empire for inspiration and verification. With advanced kingdoms already existing in these regions, the possibilities of Phoenician and Indo-European kingdoms conquering these regions later would be much less. The chances of Basque pre-Indo-European culture and Numidian culture in North Africa surviving under the guise of Atlantean wannabe kingdoms is much greater than in our timeline. Maybe this model would have spread across Western Europe, having tribes taking up Atlantean culture as a way to show how advanced and cultured they were. Western Europe would have developed much faster in this timeline. With it being closer to a large civilization, the peoples of Europe would have taken technology and governmental institutions far earlier. This would create a very different continent later. Who knows, maybe the Celts would have become the dominant force, being able to unite under single governments, and the Romans never would have become dominant. Movement across the Atlantic would be far easier, with a huge continent in the middle to stop at. Connections between the New and Old Worlds would be closer, and trade between the two would likely be quite strong. Let's just take a brief moment and imagine the awesome things the Vikings could have done with that. Maybe raiding Brazil. Technology would be hundreds of years ahead of what we would have in our timeline. This would be for two reasons. First of which being that more cultures would simply get technology earlier. In this timeline, Western Europe, Western North Africa, and the Americas would get technology hundreds or even thousands of years ahead of when they got it in our timeline. And that would mean that there would simply be more cultures and statistically more people to develop modern technology than there would be in our timeline. And secondly, with the giant continent of Atlantis in the middle of the North Atlantic, ideas would spread much faster across the Atlantic. Chinese ideas on philosophy could be discussed amongst Aztec professors, or Toledo steel could be made in the Miami version of Toledo, Ohio. Atlantean civilization would survive on Atlantis. I don't know enough about Atlantis to see how it would develop. Would it become too isolationist and be conquered by the Romans, Norse, Basques, or Celts? Would they be eternally divided, self-centered and isolationist like India, or would they continue to reunite and make an advanced, albeit isolationist and self-centered imperial culture like China? Would they keep conquering and expanding like the Assyrians, even after decline? I don't know. I'm ending this timeline around 800 BC, so I have no clue how the world would look today, honestly. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next one. Thank you.